All right. First and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, I know most of you know me as Immortal Technique, but my real name is Felipe Andres Coronel. I wanted to start out with the subject of immigration and the separation of children and how that's not a laughing matter at all. But I want to share a joke that a young person sent me about immigration online. They said to me, a banker, a worker, and an immigrant are sitting at a table. There are 20 cookies on the table. The banker steals 19 cookies, and then he tells the worker, look out, the immigrant is going to steal your cookie. And I've thought about this joke for a long time, because I've thought about the jobs that people say that we steal, and how many of them simply have been lost to machinery. I thought about the jobs they never complain about us stealing. Like, I've never seen rallies in front of a baseball stadium, right? Like, how dare you take away these jobs and give them these Dominicans and Cubans? By the way, we're winning, so I guess maybe that's why people don't care. But we do live in an era, and we have to admit to ourselves that we live in an era where it's become popular to not care about the moral fiber of the people that represent you as long as they win. So it doesn't matter if the person is a sexual predator, or a rapist, or a liar, or a cheat. As long as he can get who we want into the Supreme Court, that's how government thinks about people who are in politics. Can they work for us? Can they win for us? And it also has an extreme effect upon the revolutionary community, because we realize that we're playing by different rules. We care if somebody's a rapist. We care if somebody's a child molester. We care if somebody's a thief or a murderer, if they're representing our causa and they're representing our people. But they don't give a fuck if that person is a morally bankrupt individual, as long as they carry out the agenda that they want. And when I say agenda, I think that people need to understand what that means. Hitler was not a person that had blue eyes and blonde hair. He was a person that had brown eyes and brown hair. But what was the agenda? Aryanism. What was he pushing? And the people accepted him for that. In the same way that there are many people who think now, because they're quote-unquote Latino, that they're light-skinned, that they can fit in somehow, that they can wave that little Trump flag, and somehow they won't be the ones that eventually get rounded up and deported. And realistically, their ideology was a failure, because they came after you too. And many of us look at that and we think, oh, you know what? I want to laugh at those people, and that's my first instinct too. But instead I feel sorry. And I tell everybody, you know what? Pity those people. Because to me, they're like those native Apaches, right? Who ended up on the same train as everybody else, shipped off their land and sent to some reservation. And they thought because they were some hang around the fort, because they served their country so well, that they would be spared this deportation to an open-air prison where there are only 2 tests for the water on those reservations. Now, in New York, where I live, there are 8 tests for water in order to make it feasibly drinkable for people and children. But on the reservation, there's still only 2 tests for water. And many of those reservations have less drinkable water at the level of Flint, Michigan. Now, why am I bringing this up? Why talk about Native American reservations? Well, because I feel like the word Latino is a misused word. I feel like it only represents Latino, Latinx, whatever you want to fucking call yourself. Do you know why? Because we're talking about a Latinized culture, right? And what does that mean? That means that the people who call themselves Native Americans, who live on a reservation or walk around here, are Anglicanized natives, right? They speak in English. And me, people from Guatemala, from Mexico, from El Salvador, from Colombia, from Peru, we're Latinized indigenous people, right? We have our indigenous culture. You listen to our music, it sounds very different. You look at our pre-Columbian civilizations, we all believe that the earth didn't belong to us, but that we belong to the earth, right? We have very similar customs when it comes to the elevation of our women and the realization of our culture. And yet we are now divided solely by these languages, so that we can't see them as extensions of ourselves, so that we don't realize that these migration routes that indigenous people had predated any Europeans that came here. And without having that honest discussion with ourselves, we can't have an honest discussion about immigration, revolution, or how to move forward. I wanted to make this conversation a little bit more personal because I can sit here and spew facts to you all day long, and I can act like a human teleprompter, and there were people who would be pleased with that. But without me making a personal story, I think that the communication and the conversation is only half served. And I want to tell you, I'm sorry, my mother wanted me to be a lawyer, but it never really worked out. But what's interesting is that I became a teacher in prison, and I learned something there. If you're only teaching people by your successes, whether you're a lawyer, a doctor, whether you're a teacher, whether you're a professional, or whether you're a person who just works a regular job of any sort that you would be proud of or that you are dedicated to, if you're only teaching people from your successes, you're not teaching these young people anything. You're just bragging to them. You cannot teach people from your successes. Where is the teaching from the failures? Where do you tell your students, no, this is what happened to me when my heart was broken and I felt suicidal, when I lost my job and I was on the outs, when I thought I was going to be with this person for the rest of my life and it fell apart like a house of cards, when I had everything figured out and then I ended up in prison, when I poured my heart out to the person that I thought would be there for the rest of my life and then they left me with my dick in my hand, standing in the middle of the street, drunk as a motherfucking junk. Pardon my language. But isn't that more honest than, I went to college, studied. If you work really hard, you too can be a success. Children don't hear you say, don't smoke weed. They see you rolling it. So if you tell them don't smoke while you're rolling it, they see you rolling it. They don't care what you say. The conversations with our youth needs to be about us being a living example to them, a fearless living example. And in order to be a fearless living example, I have to talk about the things that I don't necessarily talk about. I was born not here in the United States, but I was born in Peru. I'm sorry about the World Cup. I cried. Not really. But at the time in Peru when I was born, there was a specific situation that was going on there that led to my immigration here. I was born at a time in which Maoist guerrillas were fighting with a CIA-backed paramilitary, right? In a time in which there was 2,000% inflation. And I think people can hear that and say, oh wow, that's a lot. But I don't think people really understand what that means because this country hasn't seen that for almost 100 years. The point where imagine you go into the store, doesn't matter if you're white, black, brown, whatever orientation, however you identify yourself, that they don't give a fuck about. It's just the fact that that $100 does not equal $100 no more. It just equals $10. And then one day you go in there and the $100 equals $1. And then one day you go in there and they say, we don't even use this currency. These coins that you have, you can make earrings out of them and sell them for more than you could actually get for the coin. The metal itself is worth more when you melt it down. And in that middle of that turmoil, in order to find peace and quiet, my father decided to move us to Harlem in the 1980s. And it was a very, very interesting cultural exposure that I had at that particular time. One thing I always remind people is that I had a slight accent, right? Un acento. If I want to, I can still have an accent. It's not a problem. But my father was very, very adamant. He said, you know what? I want you to learn to speak English and understand it the way they do. And I want you to learn their history better than you know them. So you know what he used to do? He used to take me to the museum. And he would make me say the names of these complex dinosaurs, right? And in order to do that, I kept saying it again and again. And he said, it's because the muscles in your mouth aren't being used to speak English. That's why he'll constantly say Sprite or Espanol instead of Spanish or Sprite, right? Or pizza instead of pizza, right? Which I don't care. I want a pizza, carajo. I'm sorry. I don't care. That doesn't bother me now. I'll say pizza just to say it. But after saying Pachycephalosaurus a million times, Gramphorhynchus and Stegosaurus and Diplodocus and all these other dinosaurs, eventually I developed the way of speaking that you'll hear now, right? And what was interesting about this is that we compare these accents and how they're perceived by people. And it does tell a lot about the cultural dynamic that we're facing. And it does snatch away the false premise that people on the right will tell us that immigration has nothing to do with race. Really. So when someone comes with a French accent, and they happen to be a light-skinned person, or a Swedish accent, why is that cute? And why is a person from India's accent offensive? Right? Why is a person from Mexico's accent offensive? Right? When a person from a European country's accent is seen as exotic and pretty and, oh, that's so cute. That's the reality that has been set up in this country. And I think it's because we never had a conversation about what happened when Europeans came. And I'll interrupt my personal story just to tell that. When Europeans first came to America in mass, right, they did not just apply for citizenship, they applied for whiteness. Why? Because unless you were white, at that time Greeks, Italians, Armenians, these people were not considered white. They were considered swarthy, part African. We don't want them here. We know they got a log in the fire because of the curly hair type people. But the reality was, if you were not considered white, you know what would happen? You would not be allowed to own property outside of the red line district. You would not get a loan from the bank. You would not be able to join the police department, which we've all discovered is the route to political power in local politics, holding office that is unmovable. You would not be able to join the fire department. And the fire department is interesting because they get paid off of every room that exists in a city. If you've ever been in a room, even this one, it'll say capacity, occupancy, and you see that occupancy right there? It says 227. Somebody had to pay the fire department for them to write that. And in many clubs, they put a bigger number than it should be, and they put money under the door. But the reality is that we were closed off to these things. And there are many cases in which people had applied for whiteness, and they were specifically told by the American government, I'm sorry, you're not white. There was a case of a Japanese man who said, well, you know what, my skin is actually whiter than the average white man. And written in the conversation of the response from the government, this government, the official response is, no, you belong to a Mongoloid race. You are not part of a white European race. Again, the reality check, what Paul Mooney used to call the nigga wake-up call to people. Because you think, oh, man, I'm here, I've got it, oh, no. Those people know who's white and who's not. And in reality, that was the sickness of it, that racial disparity was injected into those politics. So the idea of the melting pot was really about melting down the races of Europe to create the ideology of a white person. And that was the invention of white people, because before that, you weren't just considered some huge splotting mass of whiteness. No, you had your own individual culture. Irish people had Gaelic, and they resented English being dumped upon them. Right? The people from the Baltic states, they had a Livonian crusade, which means they were forcibly converted to Christianity the same way we were. You ask any person from Greece, they resented Western Europe because during the Fourth Crusade, these people didn't attack anywhere in the Middle East. They sacked Constantinople. What does that teach us? Right? If half the Crusades weren't against Muslims, who were they against? Other denominations of Christianity. Why am I bringing up all this history and relating it back to where we are today? Because without a proper history lesson, I don't think that we can have a conversation about anything having to do with immigration. And I think that it benefits people when they don't have to have the historical context involved in anything. They can just say at some point, well, that doesn't matter. Until the facts, of course, come into their play and they say, oh, we want to accept these facts. I've dealt with people like that, especially from a religious perspective. I choose to call them salad bar Christians. Because they go to the Christian salad bar and they decide what they want. They decide to pick out this little passage about how, if you're gay, you're going to burn in hell for the rest of your life, which is not even in the Bible. And then they decide that dropping a bomb on a child is somehow less offensive than two people of the same sex kissing each other, or someone getting an abortion. Oh, okay. So that a person who's raised can't be available to have the pregnancy terminated, but you can drop a bomb on a school and you think that somehow that's collateral damage. You change the narrative so that nothing at all bears any semblance to some responsibility. And when I talk about responsibility, it's important because we've all given up some of our freedom for that responsibility that this quote-unquote government is supposed to show us. And what's sad is that I think we've all come to the conclusion, everyone in this room, that it's not really a capitalist system. It feels more like a Ponzi scheme, right? Like something you were never designed to win. Like a lottery in an Italian neighborhood in 1915 or something. Nobody was winning it. I think it's something else that has to be discussed, is that as a young person, I can remember getting arrested. And I was in trouble, and that's no secret to none of my fans. You know that I went to prison, you know that I got locked up. But what's not really in the story is the idea that every time I got arrested, I was constantly threatened by NYPD with deportation. And I never took it seriously, because I always thought that there are 5 steps before deportation. There are 3 JP cards, and then you have to be sent to Rikers or someone else for you to be considered for deportation. And I thought to myself, well, man, I'm 16, I don't have no papers. You know, I'll do whatever I want to do. But as the arrest records started piling up more and more, I started to think to myself, wow, this is a possibility. However, I still had some kind of lifeline, some kind of life net. I had other members of my family that were citizens, right? So I still never experienced the harshness the way other people did. However, I got to see that in my family, especially when my own cousin was deported recently. And I want to tell you his story without telling you his name, because it's very important, and I think it pertains exactly to what's going on with these children. My cousin was born on the spectrum, right? So at some point, we thought that we would come together as a family, and that everything would work out, and that we would have him with us. And believe me, I don't talk a lot about my personal family, so I'm trying to be as focused and not, not taking the heart in front of me. But it hurts to talk about this. It hurts me in a place that I don't talk about with most people. He was on the spectrum, and when he was incarcerated and put in this facility, he was thrown to solitary confinement for 5 months. He was strip searched constantly. Every time he spoke back, he said that they would routinely physically assault him. Now, being a person that has actually been incarcerated or in prison, I can tell you about my first day in prison, when they were dividing the men and the women, right? They said the women are intake here and the men are here. And I always remember an old white lady gave the CO a fucking attitude and spit at her. And the CO cracked her in the head with a stick. And when she hit the floor, they took these 2 lightning rods and they started peeling her. And I always remember they dragged her in front of the men's cell and they looked at me, and he looked at me and the dude next to me and he goes, if we'll do this to a white bitch, imagine what we'll do to one of you niggas when you get out of line. So if this is going on in a prison, what goes on in a place where they feel people aren't even people and they have no human rights? Now my cousin, he got fed up with this place. He said it was driving him even more crazy. He said, I can't control it. I don't even like that word crazy, but just the system itself implied that, right? Hardly any human communication. And when he was finally released and I saw him back in Beirut, he started breaking down. He started imagining that there were voices there. We took him to a mental hospital, and we found out that he was developed bipolar psychosis, and he started hearing voices in his head. He started hearing people telling him to kill himself, that he would be better off without him. And I started asking him, I said, yo, what did these people tell you when you were there? What did they say to you? And he said that they told him that he should kill himself instead of taking up the resources of the people that live here. And I said, well, how is that not a direct correlation to how he feels about himself now? And then the question then becomes, if they're doing this to a 20, 21-year-old kid, and he can barely stand up to that, right? What happens when that kind of abuse is poured on to a 3, 4-year-old child? What happens when a 10-year-old child hears that? How do they process that? I understand that we have a group of lawyers here, and we need that army. But we also are going to need an army of healthcare professionals to deal with these children when they get out. Now, in about a week, I'm going to go to the border with a group called the Water Angels. You can follow them. They're on my Instagram, and they do work like water drops, and they work with the shelters and the people that kept behind. And I'm going to visit the shelter where people are waiting to be reunited with their children. And what we're going to do is we're raising funds so that we can afford to hire workers, either social workers, mental health professionals, to deal with the trauma of reuniting these children. You see, I went to prison, but I come from a special species of people in prison. People that never got robbed, never got raped, never got slashed, because we like to fight, and we knew how to fight. But you know what? Even though I have conversations with people that say, oh, you know, that same thing, I made it out intact, as we call it, but we didn't really come out unscathed. We were humiliated. Even the big D's, you niggas, they don't like to talk and use that word humiliated. But when someone says, strip the fuck down naked, turn around and spread your ass cheeks and get on the ground, and a man is screaming for you to do that, you feel like you're being violent. Right? You feel like someone's trying to rape you. You feel like someone's taking away a piece of your man. And even though there's all these other things that are so stereotypical about prison never happen to you, every time you went and got a visit, that's what happens. For those of you who have people, friends, family that are locked up, remember, if you go visit them, they pay a price for you visiting them, right? And that's that strip search that they are the ones that are totally at the disposal to decide how far it goes. How invasive do we want to be? This guy gave me a fucked up attitude. I think he broke something. Put something up his ass and find out if he has something there. What are you gonna do? Fight all the COs because you're such a big fucking tough guy? Oh, you down south, you're a big tough Sureño? Oh, up north, you're a big tough Norteño? They don't give a fuck about that. Nothing. Because you're not tough in there. I hear people say all the time, oh, the inmates run the prisons. How come they eat shit food, huh? How come they pay $7 a minute to talk to their families? You want to feel tough? I know that. I get that. I wanted to feel tough too. But it's hard to admit that you're a fucking slave. It hurts to admit that you have no control and no power. Just like it hurts us to see those kids in cages because we think to ourselves, damn, we have no control, no power, until we realize for a moment that we have all the power. We have all the resources among us. We have all the ability, all the wherewithal to make it happen. Is it going to be easy? No. It requires sacrifice. It requires pain. But I think when we speak about ICE and their detention facilities, I think it's important to measure something out. When I saw what was going on in terms of how they dealt with mental illness and how they simply put them in a cage and forgot about it, it reminded me of 17th and 18th, 19th century mental hospitals, where they would literally just chain people and put them inside a cage. So it's not that ICE doesn't want to be or wants to be inhumane. It's beyond that. It doesn't have the capacity to be humane. It doesn't even have the ability or the resources, the professionals, the protocols, the semblance of humanity. It's not even organized barbarism. It's basically barbarism with the illusion of organization. I think that when we bring all of this together as a group of people, I think one of the best things that we can do is network with one another, right? This is a space where I feel like we're all here for the same reason. But we shouldn't think that we don't have this many people in the room and we don't have one or two enemies present. We always have to remember that there is a need for public conversations and for private conversations. Social media is very important for organizing, but it's also a Fed trap. It's also a way to get everybody to give you their diary and tell you what they're doing and tell you where they are and tell you who they know and tell you what they said to who they know. You know, I put out an album a long time called Revolutionary Volume 2. Produced mostly by my brother Southpaw, who's in the building somewhere. But what was interesting is that I was called a conspiracy theorist because I made 3 specific claims on the record. One of them was that the Iraq War was based on lies. Oh my God! I turned out to be so wrong about that back in 2003. Then I claimed that the government was tapping your emails and your phones. I said, and people said, technically that's ridiculous. You conspiracy theorist. How could you say these things? I'm not saying this to shock value. I'm saying it because the worst thing that we can do as people is doubt our instincts, right? Is doubt your resolve. The worst thing a person can do is doubt their intuition. We feel like that after we've been in an abusive relationship, right? We think to ourselves, man, you know what? I knew this person was bad for me. I knew I should have gotten out earlier. I ignored my intuition. We've been in an abusive relationship with this stepfather called America for quite some time. They moved into our house about 500 years ago, and they stole our indigenous children then and tried to remake them in schools, these native schools. I visited one of these schools with my brother, rest in peace, Russell Means, a great indigenous activist. God bless him. And he showed me these classrooms that were now closed to the public because the school had become a museum. And when I went in these classrooms, I saw horrible things. I saw places where kids had been placed on the wall and whipped. I saw inside their desks where they had carved, send me home, get me out of here. And then the saddest part is I saw a picture of a native boy with a tear running down his eye and a hand grabbing him from behind. I think that when we talk about the horrors that are going on in this country, we have to say, we can't say that's not who we are. We have to say that's not who we strive to be, but that's what this country has been. Because the truth of the matter is that when we say things like, oh, we're all immigrants, no, we're not all immigrants. Some people were here for thousands of years. Some people did not choose to come here. And on top of that, we're lied on about what happened when they got here. And I want to touch on that very, very importantly. Because I think that there are a lot of false narratives that are built to create distance between the black and brown community so that we don't have more of these conversations, right? When I hear things like, oh, you black people sold yourselves into slavery. Oh, listen, brother, I come from Harlem, which means I had to do my P's and Q's on this. So I learned that in the early 15th century, 16th century, the European kings decided to create a faction, a break to the faction disputes so they could exploit the slave trade in West Africa. They also decided that every king of West Africa who was not down with the slave trade could then be replaced and put with a person that would engage in the slave trade. So what are we saying? We're saying that when a king was not down with this particular movement because they realized that chattel slavery on this side of the world was different than the indentured servitude that Africans practiced amongst each other. And this is just fact. It's that that was no longer acceptable and that king needed to be removed. So don't oversimplify the struggles of people. Also, when we talk about the people that need to be deported, they're not here, we ask ourselves, and I've had more in Afghanistan, we're protecting the poppy fields and people that support the invasion and burning the heroin fields and people that support the Taliban. Also, that heroin that comes from our allies is good enough for a nigga to shoot at his arm here, but the Taliban heroin isn't good enough too? When I see stuff like that, it leads me to understand that hypocrisy is not just a tool, but it's an ideology of what we've been dealing with here, right? We project, or rather this country projects on others what it thinks is going to happen. And this happens with our allies as well. So we hear things from Israel like, oh, these Palestinians